Alexander Cole had everything a man could dream of if one only looked at the surface. He was young, brilliant, and the heir to a technology empire in New York City that touched almost every corner of modern life. His company Coltech powered hospitals, schools, and governments with software and devices that people relied on daily. Yet the tabloids had branded him with a cruel nickname that cut deeper than any business rival could. They called him the billionaire who cannot get it up. The phrase splashed across gossip magazines and late-night shows, humiliating him in ways that money could not erase. Strangers whispered in fancy restaurants when he entered. Investors smiled politely, but exchanged glances that said they knew the rumor. Women eyed him with a mix of pity and curiosity, wondering if the gossip was true. Beneath the facade of control, Alexander lived with a secret he never wanted the world to know. He suffered from face blindness, a neurological condition that robbed him of the ability to recognize faces, including his own, in the mirror. For years he had hidden this condition, developing tricks to survive board meetings and social events. He memorized voices the way someone walked the cut of their hair or the shape of their glasses. He built a fortress of coldness around himself so that no one could see the cracks. To outsiders he seemed aloof, a classic cold CEO, but the truth was far more painful. He was isolated, trapped in a world where every face blurred into uncertainty. Across the city, in a cramped apartment, Emily Rivera folded her scrubs after another grueling night shift. She worked as a nurse at a public hospital where the pay barely covered rent and the bills for her younger brother's treatment. She was strong because she had to be. Life had given her little choice. Emily had learned to speak with blunt honesty because in emergency rooms, sugarcoating never saved a life. One night, as the hospital buzzed with late arrivals, a tall man walked into her unit. He carried himself with a kind of confidence that screamed money and privilege, but he looked out of place among the stretchers and flickering fluorescent lights. She assumed he was another wealthy patient trying to bypass the system. Without hesitation, she held out a clipboard and said, "Sir, if you are here as a patient, you need to follow the rules. No exceptions." Alexander froze, startled not just by her tone, but by the fact that she looked directly at him as if she could pierce through the armor he had built. He opened his mouth to explain, but she continued briskly. "Men who come in here need to be honest about their problems. Pretending you are fine only makes things worse. If you have an issue, face it. A man should be brave enough to deal with his own body." The words hit him like a strike to the chest. No one had ever spoken to him that way. Most people cowered before his name or bent over backward to please him. Yet this woman treated him like he was simply another stubborn patient. He felt embarrassment, a flash of anger, and something else that unsettled him even more. He felt curious. That night, Alexander could not shake her voice. He replayed her words in his head while staring out from the glass walls of his penthouse, the city glittering below. His life was filled with admirers, models, and socialites, but not one of them had made his heart race with indignation and intrigue at the same time. Emily had no idea who he was, and that made her honesty sharper. Meanwhile, Emily walked home unaware of the storm she had stirred. She only thought of him as another arrogant man who needed to be reminded that money did not buy courage. She never imagined that the billionaire who kept appearing in the headlines would remember her. Behind closed doors, Alexander faced another kind of pressure. His grandmother, the matriarch of the family, had grown tired of his detached image. The board of directors whispered about stability, about the need for a leader who could project the warmth of a family man. His Uncle Richard circled like a hawk, ready to snatch power if Alexander appeared weak. The truth was simple and brutal. If Alexander did not prove that he could lead not only with intelligence, but with a picture of personal stability, the board might shift control to Richard. The stakes were nothing less than his life's work. And so as the city slept, Alexander remembered the bold nurse who had mistaken him for a patient. A spark of reckless inspiration lit inside him. Maybe, just maybe, she could be the answer to the problem he had spent years avoiding. Emily Rivera started her next shift at the hospital with the same determination she carried every day. She never thought about the tall man she had scolded the night before, because in her world there was no time for lingering thoughts. There were too many patients, too many emergencies, and too many bills waiting at home. Her younger brother Miguel needed medication that was not fully covered by insurance, and every extra hour she could pick up meant another month of stability for him. She pushed herself into the rhythm of blood pressure checks, IV drips, and patient charts. In her mind, that encounter with the stranger was already fading into the blur of countless faces she saw each night. On the other side of the city, Alexander Cole sat in the boardroom of Coltech, staring at the sleek table as voices echoed around him. The board of directors had gathered to discuss quarterly projections, but beneath the polite language there was an undercurrent of tension. His Uncle Richard leaned back in his chair, his expression calm yet calculating. Richard had spent years waiting for a moment to undermine Alexander, and now he had found the perfect weapon. A young board member finally spoke what everyone had been thinking. Alexander, your leadership is unquestioned in terms of numbers, but the public image of this company has begun to suffer. The rumors about your personal life create instability in investor confidence. The words stung, though Alexander showed no reaction. Another director added, stability matters in leadership. The public and the press should see a man who embodies not only vision, but also family values. If you cannot provide that, we may have to reconsider the distribution of voting power within the board. Richard smiled faintly, pretending to be supportive, but clearly savoring the pressure mounting on his nephew. The ultimatum became clear. If Alexander could not present himself as a man grounded with family stability, the board could transfer authority to Richard. It was not written in law, but in the world of corporate power perception was reality. Alexander left the meeting with a storm raging inside him. For years he had built Coltech with his sweat and genius surviving whispers, and fighting through the fog of his condition. Now everything could be taken away by the shallow judgment of image. He needed a solution fast. That night his mind drifted back to the bold nurse whose eyes had cut through him like no one else had. Emily Rivera. She had spoken without fear, without calculation, without knowing who he was. And perhaps that was the key. She was authentic in a world where everyone else played a role around him. If he could convince her to stand by his side, even if only for appearances, the board would have no argument left. The thought was reckless, but irresistible. Meanwhile, Emily was confronted by her own struggles. Miguel's hospital bills arrived with brutal clarity. She sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands, wondering how she would make it work. She considered picking up a second job, but she was already working night shifts, and her body was stretched thin. As she flipped through the envelopes, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find the same tall man from the hospital, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that looked completely out of place in her modest hallway. For a moment she did not recognize him, but then the memory of her sharp words returned. "You again," she said cautiously. Alexander inclined his head. "Yes, me again. We did not have the chance to introduce ourselves properly. My name is Alexander Cole." The name landed like a thunderbolt. Everyone in New York knew that name. Emily blinked in disbelief. "You are the Coltech guy, the billionaire. Why are you here?" Alexander studied her reaction with a calm mask. "Because I need something from you." She crossed her arms. "And what exactly could I possibly give you?" He hesitated only a second before answering. "I need a wife." Emily stared at him, convinced she had misheard. "Excuse me." Alexander explained everything with the precision of a man used to making deals. The board threatened his control, they demanded stability, and the fastest way to project stability was marriage. He offered her a proposal as blunt as her words had been in the hospital. "Marry me for 1 year. It will be a contract marriage, no romance, no intimacy required. In exchange, I will make sure your brother's medical expenses are covered and you will be financially secure." Emily almost laughed at the absurdity. "You want me, a nurse from Queens, to be your wife? That is insane." Alexander did not flinch. "Insane, perhaps, but effective. You are honest and you are not part of the society games I am surrounded by. That makes you perfect." Emily felt her anger rising. "Do you think I am some charity case you can buy?" He shook his head. "I think you are the only one who can help me." Silence stretched between them, heavy with disbelief and tension. Emily wanted to slam the door, but then Miguel coughed from the other room. Reality hit her like ice water. The bills on the table reminded her of the weight she carried alone. Still, she fought back. "Why me? You could have any model or socialite." Alexander's voice softened slightly. "Because they all want me for my money and my name. You do not. You even scolded me without knowing who I was. That is exactly why it has to be you." Emily shook her head in disbelief, but the seed had been planted. She told him to leave, needing time to think. Alexander inclined his head and left her with his business card, the black letters embossed on thick white stock. That night, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The idea was ridiculous, yet the thought of Miguel's future gnawed at her. Pride and desperation wrestled in her heart. By morning, she knew her life was already at a crossroads. The marriage contract was drawn up with the efficiency of a corporate merger. Alexander's lawyers arrived at Emily's apartment the very next day, their briefcases snapping open to reveal pages of legal terms that made her head spin. Clause after clause spelled out the conditions the union would last 1 year. She would attend social events as his wife. She would move into his residence, and in return, all her brother's medical bills would be covered, along with a generous monthly allowance. Most importantly, there was one line that seemed to leap from the page: no romance and no intimacy. Emily signed with trembling hands, her pride warring with her desperation, while Alexander signed with calm detachment, as though he were approving another business acquisition. Within a week, she moved into his penthouse on the Upper East Side. The elevator opened into a space that looked like something from a glossy magazine. Spread all glass walls, marble floors, and furniture that seemed more like art installations than places to sit. Emily clutched her duffel bag and whispered to herself, "This is another world." Alexander appeared from his study, dressed in another flawless suit, and observed her as if measuring her reaction. "You will find the master suite upstairs. There is staff if you need anything." She lifted her chin. "I can manage myself." He almost smiled, but then his expression hardened again. "Very well, dinner is at 8. Try to be on time." From the beginning, their lives collided in ways that revealed just how far apart they were. Emily loved greasy pizza from the corner shop and iced coffee in plastic cups. Alexander's kitchen was stocked with imported wines and delicacies she could not pronounce. On the first night, she heated leftover pizza in his gleaming designer oven, and when Alexander returned from a meeting, he found her sitting on the counter with a paper plate balanced on her knees. He frowned. "Do you know how many calories that contains?" She grinned through a mouthful of cheese. "Enough to keep me alive during a 12-hour shift." He sighed and poured himself a glass of wine that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The clash of worlds became a rhythm. She teased him for being uptight. He accused her of being careless. Yet under the banter, there was an unspoken awareness of each other. The first major test came when Alexander invited her to a gala. The event was at a hotel ballroom, glittering with chandeliers and filled with the city's elite. Emily wore a gown, selected by his stylist, a deep blue dress that hugged her figure, but she still felt like a fraud among the sparkling women who floated past in couture gowns. Alexander guided her with a hand lightly on her back, his posture perfect, his voice cold as he introduced her. "This is my wife, Emily Cole." She blinked at the use of his last name but forced a polite smile. Photographers snapped pictures, flashes exploding like fireworks. She stumbled over her words when reporters asked how they met, and in her nervous honesty she blurted, "He was kind of rude at first, but I told him off." The reporters laughed, delighted by the unpolished answer. The next day, headlines appeared online. "The Billionaire's nurse wife tells it like it is." Social media debated whether she was genuine or a gold digger playing innocent. Alexander read the stories with a tight jaw, but Emily shrugged. "At least they believe I have a backbone." Still, the comments stung when colleagues at the hospital whispered that she had sold herself. Emily carried those whispers home, slamming cupboards louder than necessary, until Alexander finally asked what was wrong. She spun on him. "They think I married you for money." He replied calmly, "Did you not?" Her eyes blazed. "I married you to save my brother. There is a difference." For a moment, silence stretched, and then Alexander said quietly, "You are right. I should not have said that." It was one of the rare times he admitted fault. Slowly, she began to realize that beneath his polished armor was a man who had forgotten how to connect. Their clashes continued. She left her shoes in the hallway, which drove him crazy. He demanded punctuality while she rolled her eyes and muttered that life was not a board meeting. Yet in small moments, cracks appeared. One evening, he found her asleep on the couch with medical textbooks spread around her, and he covered her with a blanket. Another morning, she made him instant coffee by accident, and he actually drank it without complaint because she was watching. Each act was small but carried weight. The tension between them deepened at another formal event. A famous model draped herself over Alexander, whispering suggestively, while cameras clicked. Alexander stepped back sharply, his refusal feeding the rumor that he was incapable. Emily felt eyes turn toward her, judgment heavy in every glance. When they returned home, she threw her clutch on the floor. "Do you even care that the world thinks I am a fool?" He stared at her, and for once, his mask cracked. "Do you care what the world thinks?" she snapped back. "I care that they think you cannot stand me." His eyes softened briefly. That is not the truth, but he said nothing more, leaving her confused and restless. Nights in the penthouse were filled with silence, broken only by the city noise filtering through the glass walls. Emily often stood at the window, staring at the lights, while Alexander worked late in his study. Yet even in the silence, something shifted. They were no longer strangers. They were two people bound by a contract, clashing at every turn, yet inching toward something neither of them dared to name. The weeks that followed transformed Emily's life into a constant test of endurance and adaptation as she was thrust deeper into Alexander's world, of flashing cameras, whispered boardroom politics, and the suffocating scrutiny of society pages that dissected her every move. The rumor that Alexander was incapable gained fresh oxygen when he brushed off a supermodel's advances at a fashion gala, and the rejection was captured by cameras that immediately interpreted his restraint as proof of his supposed dysfunction. The tabloids pounced, recycling the cruel nickname that had haunted him for years, and now attaching it to her as well. Dubbing her the gold digger nurse who married a man for his billions, but would never know the warmth of his touch. Emily tried to laugh it off in public, but at home the words carved wounds she could not easily hide. At the hospital, her colleagues whispered in hallways, some with pity, and others with envy, asking in mocking tones how it felt to live in a penthouse, while her husband supposedly refused her in the bedroom. She kept her head down and focused on patients, but she carried the sting home, where the silence between her and Alexander grew heavier. He noticed her quiet withdrawal, but did not know how to bridge the gulf. His instinct had always been to shut the world out, but she was not made of the same steel. One evening she confronted him after a particularly brutal day, when co-workers implied she had sold her soul. She demanded, "Do you even care what they are saying about me?" He looked up from his laptop, his face unreadable. "Words mean nothing. They cannot touch you if you do not let them." Her anger boiled over. "They do touch me. I am not you. I cannot walk through life pretending not to hear." He set his laptop aside and his eyes sharpened. "Do you think I do not hear it? Every whisper, every joke on television, every investor smirking behind his glass of wine, I hear it all. But if I show them it matters, they win." Emily's heart twisted because for the first time she saw the weight he carried. Still, she could not shake the loneliness that gnawed at her. Meanwhile, Richard watched from the shadows, feeding the press with carefully leaked stories that portrayed Alexander as aloof, incapable, and unfit to lead a company that required strength and charisma. Richard's daughter Vanessa, glamorous and ruthless, orchestrated embarrassing scenarios for Emily at public events, each designed to paint her as a clumsy outsider. At one luncheon, she switched Emily's place card so that Emily stumbled into the wrong seat beside a skeptical investor, earning laughter when she apologized. At another charity event, she whispered to reporters that Emily did not even know how to pronounce the names of the wines served at her own table. Each humiliation seemed small in isolation, but together they painted a picture of a woman out of her depth, and society began to murmur that Alexander's marriage was nothing but a desperate attempt to cling to power. The board members began to echo those murmurs. In private meetings, they questioned his judgment, suggesting that his choice of a wife who attracted negative attention reflected poorly on his capacity to lead. Richard fanned the flames by reminding them of Alexander's condition, suggesting that a man who could not even recognize faces should not be trusted with a multinational corporation. Pressure mounted until Alexander's normally calm exterior began to crack. He threw himself into work with renewed obsession, spending nights in the office determined to prove his worth through flawless numbers. But numbers did not quiet gossip. Emily noticed the lines of fatigue deepening on his face and the tension in his shoulders whenever Richard's name was mentioned. She longed to reach across the chasm that separated them, but pride kept her from showing vulnerability. Their contract still hung between them like an invisible wall, reminding her that their marriage had been built on necessity rather than choice. Yet in rare moments she saw flashes of the man beneath the armor. One night after a disastrous dinner where investors openly questioned whether she was truly fit to be a partner to a man of his stature, she returned to the penthouse ready to pack her bags. Alexander found her folding clothes into a suitcase and demanded to know what she was doing. She spat through tears. "I cannot do this anymore. They hate me and they think you are a fool for marrying me." He stood in the doorway, silent for a long moment. Then he said in a voice low but firm, "Let them think what they want. The only opinion that matters is mine." She stared at him, stunned, and he stepped closer. "You think I chose you because I was desperate. I chose you because you are the only person who has ever spoken to me without fear. That honesty is what I need more than anything." His words pierced through her defenses, but she turned away, unable to fully believe. Still, the memory of his voice lingered long after. The external pressures did not ease. Every event, every headline, every board meeting became a battlefield where Emily had to stand tall despite the whispers, and Alexander had to navigate betrayal from within his own family. The world demanded proof of their unity, but inside their home, the struggle to trust each other deepened. They were two people thrown together by necessity, clashing at every turn, yet beginning to sense that beneath the conflict lay a connection neither of them had expected. It was in this crucible of scrutiny and suspicion that the seeds of something real began to take root, though neither was ready to admit it. The turning point came during a lavish charity gala, hosted at one of the city's most prestigious hotels, an event that drew politicians, celebrities, and the sharpest critics of Alexander's leadership. Emily dressed in a gown chosen by his stylist emerald green silk that shimmered under the lights, though she felt as though she were wearing a costume. She clutched her clutch with damp hands, reminding herself to smile and stand tall. Vanessa moved through the crowd with predatory grace, her eyes glittering with malice as she orchestrated subtle traps designed to humiliate Emily. As speeches began, servers carried trays of champagne through the ballroom. Emily stepped aside to avoid one and found the heel of her shoe catching on a loose thread of carpet. She stumbled forward just as Vanessa extended a hand to her with false sweetness. The crowd gasped when Emily spilled her drink across the tablecloth, splattering the lap of a wealthy donor. Laughter rippled through the room, cameras clicked, and whispers hissed like venom. Emily's cheeks burned as she bent to apologize, her heart pounding with shame. She had always known she did not belong in this world, but now she felt the full weight of their judgment. Then Alexander's voice cut through the noise like a blade. Enough. He stepped forward, placing himself between Emily and the mocking stares. His eyes swept the crowd cold and commanding. "This is my wife. Disrespect her, and you disrespect me." The room fell into a hush. No one dared laugh now. Alexander guided Emily upright, his hand steady, against the small of her back. For the first time since their arrangement began, he publicly chose her not out of necessity, but out of conviction. Emily's breath caught as she looked up at him, her shame melting into something unexpected, something warm. The evening continued, but the laughter had ceased. Reporters scribbled furiously, realizing they had just witnessed a moment of defiance that would make headlines. Alexander remained at Emily's side, introducing her to investors with a tone that left no room for doubt. By the end of the night, the whispers had shifted, some skeptical, but others grudgingly impressed. Back in the limousine, Emily sat in silence, her fingers twisting together. "Thank you," she murmured at last. He turned his head slightly. "For what?" "For standing up for me." He regarded her with unreadable eyes before replying. "I did not stand up for you. I stood up for us." The words echoed inside her long after they returned to the penthouse. That night something shifted in Alexander as well. For years, faces had been blurred outlines to him, indistinguishable a haze that left him isolated. But when he looked at Emily in that ballroom, he had seen her face with startling clarity, as if she alone had been etched into his vision. Back in his study, he stared at her photograph, realizing he could truly recognize her, when no other face had ever broken through. The revelation unsettled him more than any boardroom threat. He sought the counsel of a neurologist who explained that sometimes intense emotional connections could trigger new pathways in the brain, offering fleeting moments of recognition. Alexander listened with a mixture of hope and fear. If Emily was the key to unlocking the world of faces he had been denied, then she was no longer just a partner in a contract, but the center of a transformation he had never believed possible. He said nothing to her, but his gaze lingered longer when she laughed, and his voice softened when he spoke her name. Emily noticed the subtle changes, but did not understand them. She only knew that when he touched her arm that night, her skin tingled in a way that no contract could explain. Yet doubt gnawed at her. Could she trust a man who had entered her life through a deal, who had promised no intimacy, yet now looked at her with eyes that seemed to ask for more? Her heart wavered between fear of betrayal and the dangerous pull of desire. Late one night, as rain streaked the glass walls of the penthouse, she found Alexander standing at the window, his silhouette framed by lightning. He spoke without turning. "Do you ever wonder if this arrangement is changing into something else?" Her breath caught. She had no answer. When he turned his face toward her, she saw a vulnerability that mirrored her own. For once, he was not the untouchable billionaire, but a man reaching for connection. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she brushed against his. The silence between them was heavy with possibility. He leaned in, and for a heartbeat, she thought he would kiss her, but he stopped just short his breath, warm against her cheek. "Not yet," he whispered. She pulled back, confused and aching, but deep down she understood. Something had begun between them, something neither of them could deny. The world still saw a contract marriage a convenient alliance for power, but within the walls of their private life a spark had been lit. That spark terrified Alexander because it threatened the careful control he had built, and it terrified Emily because it threatened the independence she clung to. Yet neither could extinguish it. They were bound now not only by signatures on paper, but by a growing truth that slipped through every defense they tried to build. The fragile bond that had begun to form between Alexander and Emily was soon tested by forces neither of them could control, as Richard and Vanessa prepared their most ruthless move yet. For weeks they had been feeding rumors to a hungry press, but whispers were no longer enough, and Richard understood that if he wanted to strip Alexander of power, he would need to strike Emily directly. A carefully fabricated dossier began circulating among reporters, complete with false medical records and bank statements that suggested Emily had accepted money from wealthy patients during her years as a nurse. The narrative was clear and poisonous. Emily was not a devoted healthcare worker, but a nurse escort who had used her position to profit from vulnerable men before ensnaring the billionaire heir. The story broke on a Friday morning when headlines screamed across every newsstand and social media feed. Emily's phone buzzed relentlessly with messages from friends and colleagues, some worried, others cruel. At the hospital, a fellow nurse looked at her with pity and asked in a whisper, "Is it true?" Emily's face burned with humiliation as she rushed through her shift under the weight of suspicious stares. When she returned to the penthouse, a swarm of paparazzi waited outside, shouting questions about her supposed past. She shoved through them, trembling, her heart breaking. Inside, Alexander stood by the window, his phone in hand, his expression carved from stone. She expected anger, accusations, demands for explanation, but instead he simply said, "Sit down." She did not. "Is this what you think of me?" she demanded, her voice raw. "Do you believe them?" His silence was unbearable. He had always been a man who measured words carefully, but now every second of quiet felt like a verdict. Finally he said, "The story will pass." "That is not an answer," she cried. "Do you believe me or not?" His gaze flickered just enough to wound her. Emily felt the ground vanish beneath her. If even he doubted her, then what was left? With tears blurring her vision, she whispered, "I thought you of all people would see me, not the lies." She turned and fled into the bedroom, slamming the door, leaving Alexander alone with his turmoil. He had not meant to doubt her, but years of betrayal had made him wary of trust, and Richard knew that weakness well. What Emily could not see was that Alexander had already dispatched investigators to trace the leaks and dismantle the smear campaign. He played the part of indifference in public to shield her from the storm, but to her it felt like abandonment. Days passed in painful silence. Emily avoided him whenever possible, burying herself in caring for Miguel and volunteering for extra shifts just to escape the suffocating penthouse. At night she cried quietly, wondering if she had made the worst mistake of her life by signing that contract. The press continued to hound her, calling her names that sliced into her dignity: gold digger, escort, fraud. Each headline seemed heavier than the last. The board seized the opportunity, pressing Alexander with pointed questions about his judgment, suggesting that his choice of wife had permanently damaged the company's reputation. Richard smirked during meetings, planting seeds of doubt in every ear. Emily reached her breaking point one evening when she overheard two bored wives at a dinner whispering that she had probably seduced patients for money. She excused herself from the table, ran into the restroom, and broke down. When she returned home, she packed a bag ready to leave. Alexander found her at the door. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "Away," she replied, her eyes glistening with anger. "You cannot buy my silence with medical bills, not if you do not even believe me." For once, Alexander's mask cracked. He grabbed her wrist, not in anger, but in desperation. "I am protecting you," he said fiercely. "By saying nothing, by pretending not to care, I keep them from digging deeper." Emily shook her head. "That is not protection. That is abandonment." She pulled free and walked past him, leaving him in the doorway staring after her. Alone in the penthouse, Alexander's chest ached with a pain he had long denied himself. He wanted to run after her, to tell her he had never believed the lies, but pride and fear held him back. He had lost so many battles of trust before, and the cost of opening his heart terrified him. Yet deep inside, he knew that this silence was destroying the only real connection he had ever found. Emily spent the night at a friend's apartment, staring out at the city lights with tears on her cheeks. She told herself she was finished with him, that she could survive without his money, that she would find another way to care for Miguel. But her heart betrayed her, because even in her anger, she longed for the man who had once stood in front of a ballroom and declared her his wife. She wondered if that man had only been a performance, or if somewhere beneath the armor he still meant those words. Neither of them slept. As the city turned beneath them, both caught in the same storm of betrayal, silence, and aching love. The breaking point arrived when Richard arranged a press conference at a downtown hotel, inviting reporters, investors, and curious onlookers with the promise of exposing the truth about Alexander Cole. Emily had returned to the penthouse the night before, not out of reconciliation, but because Miguel's health required stability. Yet the silence between her and Alexander remained thick with mistrust. That morning the television blared with headlines announcing that Richard Cole would address the future of Coltech and reveal damning information about Alexander's capacity to lead. Emily felt sick as she watched clips of paparazzi flooding the lobby where the conference would be held, their microphones raised like weapons. She wanted to believe Alexander would fight back, but she feared his silence would continue, crushing her in its weight. At the event, Richard took the stage. His smile polished his voice, dripping with false concern. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we all admire my nephew's genius, but genius is not enough. When a company's stability and future are at stake, he has hidden conditions, private struggles that make him unfit to serve as the face of this empire." Reporters buzzed pens, scratching furiously. Richard gestured toward a large screen where headlines about Alexander's rumored impotence flashed alongside the scandalous articles about Emily. "Can you trust a man who cannot even manage his own household to manage billions of dollars?" Richard asked smoothly. The room erupted with questions, and Emily, seated near the back, felt her cheeks burn as cameras turned toward her. A reporter shouted, "Mrs. Cole, how much are you being paid to stay in this marriage?" Another sneered, "Did you sell your nursing license for a penthouse?" She rose trembling, ready to flee, when a sudden hush fell over the crowd. Alexander had entered. He walked to the podium with the calm authority of a man used to commanding attention. though inside his heart pounded. He took the microphone and let the silence stretch until every eye was fixed on him. "Yes," he said at last, his voice resonant. "I have a condition. I suffer from face blindness. I cannot recognize faces, not even my own in the mirror." Gasps rippled through the room. "But that does not make me weak. What makes someone weak is betrayal, for money selling lies, to destroy family for power." He turned his gaze toward Richard, whose smile faltered. Alexander pressed a button, and a new set of documents appeared on the screen. Evidence his investigators had compiled: financial records, offshore accounts, and bribes traced back to Richard. "These are the truths Richard Cole does not want you to see. He has siphoned millions from Coltech and used them to fund his own ventures." The crowd roared with shock as reporters shouted for confirmation. Richard stammered, trying to deny it, but the documents were irrefutable. Cameras swung between uncle and nephew, the tension electric. Then Alexander did something no one expected. He stepped aside and gestured for Emily. "Come here," he said gently, his voice carrying in the microphone. Emily froze, her heart racing, but something in his eyes called to her. Slowly she walked forward, the jeers of moments ago replaced by murmurs of anticipation. Standing beside him, she felt the weight of 1,000 cameras, but also the strength of his presence. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for a fleeting moment he saw her face with absolute clarity. Turning back to the crowd, he said, "This is my wife. She is not a fraud, not an escort, not a gold digger. She is a nurse who has spent years saving lives, while men like my uncle sought only to enrich themselves. She is the only person who has ever spoken to me without fear, and she stands with me even when the world believes lies." Emily's chest tightened, tears threatening her eyes. Reporters called out, "Mrs. Cole, is this true? Do you stand by him?" Emily gripped the microphone with trembling hands. "I am a nurse," she said firmly. "I stand for healing, not for lies. I stand with him." Her voice rang with conviction, and the room fell into stunned silence before erupting in applause, a sound so unexpected it made her knees weak. The tide had turned in a single moment. Alexander placed a steady hand on her back, pride shining in his eyes. While Richard stormed from the stage, his empire of deceit crumbling under the weight of truth. Cameras captured every second, and by evening the headlines no longer called Alexander the Billionaire, who cannot get it up, but the CEO who faced his demons and exposed corruption. Emily was hailed as the courageous nurse who stood against slander. The battle was far from over, but for the first time they stood united before the world. No longer a contract couple hiding behind walls of silence, but partners who had faced humiliation and fought back together. The aftermath of the public showdown rippled across New York like a storm finally breaking into sunlight. For days, the media replayed the footage of Alexander admitting his condition and exposing Richard, while Emily's declaration of loyalty spread on social networks with captions calling her the brave nurse who stood beside a billionaire against the odds. Strangers recognized her on the street, and instead of insults, she now heard words of support, though the scars of humiliation glimmered deep inside. In the penthouse, the silence that had once separated her and Alexander shifted into something different, less heavy, more tentative, as though they were both learning how to breathe again in each other's presence. One evening, Alexander returned from the office earlier than usual and found Emily in the kitchen reheating pizza. Instead of lecturing her on calories, he leaned against the counter and asked softly if he could have a slice. She raised her eyebrows, half amused, half suspicious, but handed him a plate. He bit into the greasy crust and surprised her with a small laugh. Not bad. She stared at him as if seeing a new man, one willing to step out of his fortress. Later that night, they sat together on the couch with Miguel's medical bills spread between them. Alexander picked one up, scanning the numbers. "These should not be your burden alone," he said, his tone uncharacteristically gentle. Emily stiffened. "I do not want your pity." He shook his head. "It is not pity, it is responsibility. You are my wife, Emily. Contract or not, your pain is mine." She felt her throat tighten, unsure how to respond. The walls she had built around her heart trembled. Days turned into small experiments of connection. Alexander suggested they ride the subway together, an idea that made Emily laugh, until she realized he was serious. He left his chauffeured car behind and followed her down into the noisy underground, where the smell of metal and humanity clashed with his immaculate suit. Passengers recognized him, but were too stunned to approach. Emily guided him through the crowd, and for once, he was the one out of place, while she moved with easy confidence. Watching her navigate the chaos, he felt something unlock inside him, a glimpse of the world through her eyes. Later, they ate pizza on a street corner, grease dripping onto napkins, and Alexander admitted quietly that it was the best meal he had had in months. Emily studied him and saw not the billionaire untouchable, but a man learning to live. One afternoon, she discovered that Miguel's latest round of treatment had been anonymously paid in full. She confronted Alexander, who initially denied involvement, but Miguel revealed he had seen Alexander at the hospital, leaving quietly. Emily stormed into the study where Alexander was buried in contracts. "Why would you do that behind my back?" she demanded, her voice trembling. He looked up, his eyes steady. "Because I wanted to help without making you feel owned." She froze, her anger dissolving into confusion and something deeper. "You still think I will run if you try to care for me," she whispered. His silence was answer enough. She stepped closer, her defenses crumbling. "My brother told me something," she said. "He told me you look at me the way our father looked at our mother, like nothing else matters." Alexander's breath caught. He had never allowed himself to admit it, but the truth was there between them, undeniable. "What started as a contract is now the only thing real in my life." He confessed, his voice raw. Emily's heart pounded. She wanted to believe, wanted to step into the warmth he offered, but fear still clung to her. The gulf between their worlds seemed impossible to bridge. Yet that night, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights, she reached for his hand, and he did not let go. For the first time since their marriage began, they allowed silence to speak, not of distance, but of closeness. The next morning he woke before dawn and watched her sleep, her face soft in the pale light. For years, every face had been a blur, but hers was clear, vivid, unforgettable. He realized with awe that she had given him more than companionship. She had given him sight. And Emily, though still unsure of the path ahead, felt the truth deep in her chest. Against all odds, against every lie and wound, she was falling in love with the man she had once thought of as nothing more than an arrogant stranger in a hospital corridor. Just when Alexander and Emily began to believe they could finally breathe freely, Richard struck back with one final desperate gambit. stripped of much of his credibility after the exposure of his financial crimes. He turned to the one weapon that could still shake their fragile bond, the truth of their marriage contract. A recording surfaced online, a grainy audio clip in which Emily's voice could be heard agreeing to the terms of a deal that sounded like a transaction rather than a union. The clip had been secretly captured by Vanessa weeks earlier when Emily had nervously reviewed the contract with Alexander's lawyers. Within hours, the recording spread like wildfire across social media. Headlines screamed that the Cole marriage was a sham, a staged performance to appease shareholders. Commentators debated whether Alexander had deceived the world, and if Emily had been nothing more than a paid actress in an elaborate play. Reporters swarmed the penthouse once again, their questions dripping with accusation. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, trembling as the news played on television. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "They will never see me as anything but a liar." Alexander had entered his jaw, clenched his phone, buzzing with calls from panicked investors. For once, he did not try to hide his frustration. "This will not break us," he vowed, but she shook her head. "It already has." That evening, a televised debate between financial analysts painted him as a manipulator who would do anything to cling to power. Emily watched in horror as her own words were twisted against her. She wanted to vanish, to disappear from a world that had scrutinized and mocked her since the day she said yes. But then she thought of the night he had defended her before the ballroom, of the way he had confessed his truth at the press conference, and of the look in his eyes when he admitted that what started as a contract had become real. She realized she could not run. The next morning, she walked into the living room where Alexander stood grimly preparing to face the board. "I want to speak," she told him firmly. His eyes darkened. "No, you do not need to put yourself through that." She lifted her chin. "I am already in it. They think I am a fraud. Let me tell them the truth." He hesitated, torn between protecting her and trusting her strength. At last he nodded. That afternoon, cameras rolled as Alexander and Emily stepped onto a stage together, facing a sea of flashing lights. The crowd was merciless, their questions cutting. "Mrs. Cole, did you marry for money? Did you sign a contract to play the role of wife?" Emily held the microphone with steady hands, though her heart thundered in her chest. "Yes," she said, her voice clear. "It started as a contract." A gasp swept the room. Reporters surged forward, ready to crucify her, but she continued before they could interrupt. "It started as a contract because I needed to save my brother and he needed to save his company. We were two people who made a deal, but somewhere along the way, when he defended me before the world, when he showed me that he could stand in the light of his own flaws, and when I saw the man beneath the armor, it stopped being about a contract. It became love." The silence that followed was deafening. Cameras zoomed in on her tearful eyes, on the sincerity etched in every line of her face. Then Alexander stepped forward, his voice steady and strong. "She gave me the strength to face a world that mocked me. She gave me the power to see faces when I thought I never could. She gave me love, and I will never let her go." The crowd erupted, half in awe and half in disbelief, but the power of their united declaration could not be denied. Investors who had doubted him began to reconsider. Ordinary people, watching at home, saw not a scandal, but a story of two flawed humans who had found each other in the wreckage of circumstance. Richard, watching from a private suite, realized his final weapon had failed. His plan to shame them had instead forged them into something unbreakable. For Alexander and Emily, the trial was brutal, but it was also clarifying. There were no more secrets, no more facades. Their contract had been exposed, their vulnerabilities laid bare, yet in that exposure they had discovered the core of what bound them. It was no longer necessity, it was choice. And in the eyes of the world, choice carried far greater power than any lie ever could. The fallout from Richard's failed attack came swiftly as authorities opened formal investigations into his financial dealings, and evidence mounted that he had siphoned millions from Coltec into hidden accounts. The board, once divided, voted unanimously to strip him of all influence, and for the first time in months, Alexander could stand at the head of the company without the shadow of his uncle looming over him. Yet even in victory, he found his gaze drifting toward Emily, who had stood beside him when the storm threatened to drown them both. The board congratulated him, investors pledged renewed confidence, and journalists lined up for interviews, but Alexander felt only the quiet pull of the woman who had transformed his world. That evening he invited her to the rooftop of the penthouse, the city glittering beneath them like a field of stars. Emily stepped into the cool night air, wrapped in a simple dress, her hair pulled back, her eyes wary after so many battles. Alexander waited beside a small table where 2 glasses of wine reflected the skyline. He turned as she approached, his face softer than she had ever seen. "I once promised you no romance and no intimacy." He began, his voice steady, but that promise was a lie meant to protect myself. Tonight I break it. She froze as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it to reveal a ring, not the ostentatious diamond she expected, but a family heirloom, a band of gold etched with delicate patterns that spoke of generations. He dropped to one knee, the city's roar fading into silence around them. No contracts, no board conditions, just us. Will you marry me again, this time for real? Emily's breath caught tears springing to her eyes as she nodded. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger and rose, pulling her into his arms as the skyline sparkled like a witness to their vow. Weeks later, they held a wedding, not in a cathedral or grand hall, but in a small garden surrounded by close friends, colleagues, and Miguel, who walked proudly down the aisle with flowers in his hands. Alexander's grandmother, once skeptical, smiled through tears as she watched her grandson exchange vows without contracts or conditions. The ceremony was simple, the words heartfelt, and for the first time, Emily felt not like an outsider in his world, but like the heart of it. Life after the wedding settled into a rhythm that was both ordinary and extraordinary. Alexander continued to lead Coltec with renewed vigor, but he left the office earlier, choosing to spend evenings cooking clumsy dinners with Emily or walking through Central Park with Miguel. Emily kept her position as a nurse, working part-time despite protests from society that she did not need to. "I want to," she insisted. "Caring for people is who I am." Alexander respected her choice, and the sight of her in scrubs after a shift became one of the quiet joys of his life. Months later, Emily discovered she was pregnant. The news left her trembling with both joy and fear, but when she told Alexander, he simply knelt before her and pressed his forehead to her stomach, whispering words she had never heard from him before. "Thank you for giving me a family." Their daughter was born on a spring morning, her cries filling the hospital room with a music that felt like redemption. Alexander held the baby in his arms, his eyes wet, and whispered, "I see her. Emily, I see her face." For a man who had lived in a blur of faceless shapes, the clarity was nothing short of a miracle. Years passed, and their love deepened through struggles and triumphs alike. Alexander learned to balance the demands of empire with the needs of his family, and Emily continued to ground him with her honesty and warmth. On quiet nights they sat together on the balcony, watching the city, their daughter asleep inside, and they spoke not of contracts or scandals, but of dreams and memories. One evening, as Emily teased him about his reputation, she asked with a mischievous smile, still worried about not getting it up. Alexander laughed the sound rich with joy and pulled her close, their daughter giggling in his lap. "I think we solved that problem," he replied, his eyes filled with love. In that moment, the scars of humiliation, betrayal, and fear faded into nothing against the strength of the life they had built. The world still called him a billionaire, but to Emily and their child, he was simply Alexander, the man who had once been broken by secrets, but who had found healing in love. Their story had begun as a contract, but had become something far greater, proof that even in the harshest glare of public judgment, true love could grow, endure, and triumph.